If your company handles personal data, it's essential to understand and comply with the 7 principles of the GDPR. If you don't, you might risk a fine of up to 20 million euros or 4% of your annual revenue in the worst case scenario. Stick with me and I'll tell you all about the 7 principles of the GDPR, and I'll give you some tips on how you can comply with them. If you're interested, we also have a blog post where we go more into depth into each of the 7 principles of the GDPR. The link is in the description. So let's get into it. All right, so here are the 7 GDPR principles, and all of the requirements in the GDPR are based off of these 7 principles. By understanding the 7 principles, it'll be easier for you to understand the rules and comply with the GDPR. Just as a disclaimer, this video is meant for beginners, and it's not meant to be a replacement for a lawyer. All right, let's dive in. All right, so the first principle tells us that the processing of personal data must be done in a lawful, fair, and transparent way. Here's what that means. Lawful means that you should be gathering and processing data with a valid legal basis. For example, getting consent from a user that you can process their data is a common way of obtaining legal basis for processing personal data. Fair means that your processing of personal data is in the best interest of the person that the data is about. Transparent means that you should clearly communicate what, how, and why you process the data that you're processing. This leads us to the second principle, which tells you that you should only process personal data for the purpose it was originally intended for. In other words, you should not reuse personal data for other purposes. Let's say you have a newsletter, and in your newsletter consent form, you state that you store the IP addresses of your subscribers in order to document when and how consent was obtained. Then you're not allowed to use these IP addresses to send your subscribers customized content, such as product suggestions that are targeted towards their geographical location. Then you would be using their personal data for another purpose, and you have to clearly state the purpose of collecting their personal data. We shouldn't keep data lying around if we don't need it. This is the core message of the third principle of the GDPR, data minimization. In other words, you should only gather and process the exact amount of personal data that you need. There's a clear difference between need to have and nice to have. If you have a newsletter, you should only gather the personal data that is necessary in order to deliver that newsletter. For instance, you might need to collect the names and the email addresses of your subscribers. But do you really need to know their job titles or the color of their eyes? The fourth principle is about having the most accurate data possible. It means that the personal data we are collecting must be correct and up to date, and that it's your responsibility as the data processor or controller to take reasonable measures to ensure that. However, this is only relevant when the accuracy of the personal data is of importance for the person the data is about. For example, say one of the subscribers to your newsletter is registered with their company email address and then leaves the company. Then, this email will no longer work, and the data on this user is inaccurate. A reasonable measure in this scenario could be to include a link in your newsletter where your subscribers can change their email addresses. The fifth principle is about deleting personal data when you don't need it anymore. Basically, you should not store personal data which is no longer needed for the purpose it was intended for. Implementing a process for destroying data in a secure way can help you ensure that data which is no longer needed is removed and not still stored on a device or in the cloud, where it could be a potential security risk. For example, if you stop sending out newsletters, you should delete the personal data of your subscribers, because the purpose of the personal data doesn't exist anymore. The The sixth GDPR principle is integrity and confidentiality. This principle is concerned with making sure that the personal data is correct and cannot be manipulated by others. It's also making sure that the only people who should have access to the data are the ones who are processing it. For example, the personal data of your newsletter subscribers should not be accessible to unauthorized people. It makes sense that Susan in marketing, who sends out the newsletters, has access to that information, but Marie in HR probably shouldn't. You should also take protective measures to ensure that the place that you store this information is protected against cyber attacks and security breaches. The last and the seventh principle is accountability. This is related to taking responsibility for the data that you are processing. It means that you, as the data controller or processor, must be accountable for the proper processing of personal data and compliance with the rules of the GDPR. When we talk about taking responsibility, it's not only about fulfilling the various requirements of the GDPR, but also being able to document that you're doing so. For instance, if you use consent as a legal basis for processing the personal data of your newsletter subscribers, and thus ensuring the lawfulness principle, you have to be able to document when and how that consent was given. Another example is that many of the principles of the GDPR require you to take organizational measures in addition to technical measures. This could, for example, be providing awareness training to your team and documenting this initiative. By doing this, you are both fulfilling and demonstrating a GDPR requirement. And that wraps up our overview of the 7 principles of the GDPR. By adhering to these principles, you'll be able to build trust with your customers and ensure the privacy and security of personal data. You'll also be able to avoid fines. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this. If you have any questions or topics that you'd like us to cover in future videos, please let us know down in the comments below. See you next time.